Welcome to the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Teresa J. Canada, and we have special guests today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about those individuals who've experienced busing in the North as opposed to those who experienced busing in the South. So I'm pleased to have our guest today, Professor Anthony Turner of Wagner College in Staten Island, New York. And he is going to discuss with us his experience of being bused to school in the state of Iowa.
Right.
So welcome, Professor Turner, welcome.
Welcome and thank you. And it's an honor to be with you and to talk about an important subject. So I can hardly wait to get into this, that's for sure.
Great. Okay, so first of all, I'd like for you to share with our audience basically some background in terms of where you lived in Iowa and some family dynamics, if you'd like to share some of those first of all.
I was born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa, the capital, and the state, even up to this point, I do believe is less than 2% African American. So there are certain cities that you will find us in: Des Moines, Marshalltown, Waterloo, those kinds of places, maybe over by Omaha, Council Bluffs, right across the Missouri River. But my family, if the families are old enough, they got there because of coal mining, and the town of Buxton, Iowa, which no longer exists, it's cinder blocks, and Iowa has some of the largest coal reserves in the country. So a lot of Black people were there. There were some farmers in the 19th century, but most of the older families came because of coal mining and being able to find jobs there.
Oh, so they came for work.
Right. And then my great-grandmother was Native American, she came from the Virginias, Carolinas. And that is where my grandmother was born, was in Buxton, Iowa. So she stayed in Des Moines. My whole immediate family was in Des Moines. My grandfather's side of the family comes from two very tiny towns in Missouri, or Missouri, depending on how you want to pronounce it.
Yes.
Places that, Higbee and Moberly, and Moberly is not too small, but Higbee certainly is. So that's the story, and that's where I started busing there in the 60s.
Okay, I was going to ask you, when did this experience take place for you in terms of the time frame, and what grade was it that you started this process? What was that like?
The busing started in 1968, and at that point I was going into second grade, and it was an experimental thing starting in Des Moines. It was all volunteers, so we didn't have the kind of rioting and things that happened by force busing, say Chicago, Boston area. And my mother was one of the only parents that showed up regularly at PTA meetings. And when she saw the statistics of one side of town versus the other, she said, okay, I have to give this a shot. And I was the youngest participant at that time, and I went all 5 years subsequently to grade school before I went to my neighborhood school. So for a while, I was the youngest and the longest person that had been in this program. There were a few of us selected. There were 3 schools that we had to choose from. And the one school, I went to Windsor Heights Elementary. My mother wanted me to go to Greenwood, but they didn't have room in the second grade at Greenwood, but they did at Windsor Heights.
Okay.
And just so you know, that Windsor Heights was one of the highest income per capita communities in the country at that time.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
And
wow, that's huge.
Of course, at that time, and even into the 70s, the Iowa Basic Skills tests were tests that were administered across the country at certain points in grade school, junior high, and then high school. I don't know if that's the situation now, but at least at that time it was. It was the most pivotal point in my life, not just only education, Dr. Canada, but from the standpoint of learning how to deal with race relations and still persevere.
Interesting.
And yeah, it was incredible. What flew off of my keyboard here was an article from 1970. And I read that sometimes because the two biggest issues in Iowa education were sex education in the schools and busing. And by a margin of at least 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, parents wanted sex education to be taught as early as 4th grade.
Oh, wow.
And I had sex education classes in 4th grade.
In 4th grade?
Yeah, they were called health classes, and they were held 4th, 5th grade, somewhere in there, and they were held on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then we had gym Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So by the time I got out of grade school, I knew about syphilis, I knew about gonorrhea. And they showed films on citizenship. You know, they were the black and white films of the 50s with the really nice dressed white children that, oh, look at how Johnny helped Susie into her seat. Oh, Johnny takes Jane's tray away at lunch, you know, that kind of thing. So it was that kind of old school teaching. And so it was interesting that busing by the same margin was not wanted in the schools. And I read that article because one of our architects who wanted to remain nameless in this community of Windsor Heights said that he didn't favor busing. We really don't need the blacks here because they're hard to manage. And as you know, that this is the perception that is not just Iowa based, but this is nationwide, where people like you and me have to be managed. We have to be watched. We don't have good sense unless we're told what to do, kind of thing. It was incredible. The principal, I'm going to name names because I don't care at this point. Her name was Virginia Lawrence. And she, like many of the other teachers, had that 60s beehive. Everybody wore heels and pearls. You did not see teachers, teachers dressed.
Yes.
And I remember her pulling the few of us that were in the busing program into her office and pointing, and I never want to see you in here for anything wrong that you've done, kind of thing. And I had students that would tell me, you know, white is right. My 5th grade teacher, I was in an accelerated reading class, who then told me that she asked me and another classmate if our parents had ever called us pickaninnies. And
teacher would say this?
Yes. And her name I'm going to leave out, but I certainly know it. And I would see her years later in junior high and pass her in the grocery store. And it was things like that that my mother and I would discuss at the dinner table if they came up. She never told me outright about the racial disparities. She waited until we sat at the dinner table. She said, "How was your school day?" And she investigated and we discussed it. A saving grace, I have to give a shout out to my 2nd grade teacher. Her name was Doris Killinger. I kept in touch with her until her dying day. She then eventually moved to Marshalltown, Iowa. And she supported me in my music endeavors, which is what I do professionally now. And Doris Killinger, years before, had taught on my side of the town, and she taught 2 of my mother's older brothers.
So, really? So it was a generational thing.
Right. And so I ended up having this white teacher in 2nd grade. I was behind in math only. Where we had math in my school, we broke wire hangers and counted with beads, like a homemade abacus. When I got to 2nd grade at Windsor Heights, they knew all of their multiplication tables, every last one. And so I was behind, but Doris Killinger would take me aside every afternoon and get me straight on math. Then I would come home. My mother, do you remember those big blue flashcards possibly?
Yes.
I would cry at the table. My grandmother would cry because she'd tell my mother, "Well, Eleanor, can't you give him a break?" She said, "No, he's going to learn this." Every evening for that whole year, flashcards on multiplication tables. So by the time I got to 3rd grade, I was straight on everything. And I was always an avid reader. But Doris Killinger was the understanding teacher.
Okay. So you had at least one.
I had at least one. There were no Black teachers, of course, at the
That was
school.
my next question. My next question, because my question also I want to ask about, can you share with us what was it like in your initial school as in terms of educational and social aspects as opposed to the new school that you attended?
Well, the thing in my Logan Elementary, which no longer exists at home, for kindergarten and first grade, kindergarten was Mrs. Helgenberg. My first grade teacher was Mrs. Hornacher. And I want you to listen to that name and think that she looked like a Hornacher from the 18th century, a school marm. So with the name like that, but Principal Shaw, who was principal at Logan at that time, he had permission from parents if we needed to be spanked. And then so she could just walk down to the school. But I was a good student, so we never had those kinds of issues. You could tell that I think that in some ways we were viewed as needing to be managed. That's how I remember it. Mrs. Helgenberg, my kindergarten teacher, I hit with my blanket at one point, and come to find out that she was not understanding of how I could be dressed so well. When my mother marched me back into that room in front of her, she said, "What is the problem? Why is this happening?" And my mother was not one of those that believed everything I said, because she knew I was a child, and but she knew how to flesh out the truth.
Okay.
And so the thing is, I felt, however, that the parents were strong in the community because it was a Black community. It was a traditional Black community where everybody was your mother and your father.
Yes, that
So
was traditional back then. Yeah.
if Mrs. Jackson told me to stop doing something,
You had to stop.
that would be better. Or guess who was going to pick up the phone and call and say, "Eleanor, I saw Tony doing something," you know? So you understand that. And by the time I got to Windsor, I would laugh, and my mother and I would talk about this even at the age of 8, that it was like seeing Leave It to Beaver in living color. So I watched Leave It to Beaver, My Three Sons, Father Knows Best.
Right.
And you know how everything, the women vacuum in pearls and high heels.
Right. Right.
So this is how I felt that looked. It was, I used to say later on, when I really could put the words behind my feelings, that some of the students were so clean they squeaked when they walked.
The students in the classroom?
That's how I felt. It was so sanitized. It was so, the hair was always,
Placed and so forth and so on.
it was almost on some level too clean. However, the education was superior. And what saved me, besides Doris Killinger, my mother, of course, and grandmother, was music. I was singing since the age of 4 or so in the choirs at church.
Okay.
And,
So was the community where you lived was a predominantly Black community? Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So it was really, but then you shared earlier that you would run into one of the teachers at the grocery store. Now that's my other question. So that meant even though your community where you grew up was pretty much in a segregated type of situation, that people did intermingle in the community in terms of grocery shopping and so forth and so on. Is that correct?
Well, sometimes it was because we would drive to another area of town where you would see those teachers, because the teachers primarily lived in Windsor Heights. So it's just a matter of if we were out at that time, the only mall and the biggest mall in Iowa was in my home state. So if we were at the mall, then we might stop at a Hy-Vee or whatever the name of the grocery store was there that it now no longer exists.
Right.
And that's where we'd see them. And a lot of times this happened a few years later when I was out of junior high and into high school, and I would go out of my neighborhood a little bit.
So from the point that you left your neighborhood school to go to this school, so all the education from that point forward was part of a more diverse group of people, yes?
I think so. And certainly by the time I got to junior high and high school, which were in my area, because then the reverse was true. My high school, we had almost 3,000 students, but we had maybe 125 Black people. And so most of the Black students went to a couple of the other schools and did not stay in the area. And
Was it by choice, or was it by choice?
it was by choice. And I think a lot of it had to do with just where your friends were going. But I wanted to go where my mother and her brothers had attended. And I didn't want to be bused anymore. I enjoyed it. I had a great time. And I wanted to go to my area schools. I had that choice.
Okay.
We talked about it. But my area schools were just fine for junior high and high school. I would have survived in any case, I tell you, only because of what my home life was like.
Okay, that's what I wanted. That's the point I want to bring up. Do you think that the foundation you had at home made the major difference, no matter where you went?
There's no doubt whatsoever. And as I matured, and once I went to college, that was the first time that I realized that there were people who didn't like their parents. So the people I associated with in my neighborhood, at least that I knew, we all liked our parents. We all loved our parents. We all got along. And years later, one of my English teachers in high school, Mrs. Westover was her name. She saw me in a grocery store and she said, when I graduated, that's when the water changed in education.
Oh, that's what she told you?
Yeah, she said, once I graduated high school, she said she saw the switch in students and parents and how teachers were, teachers were revered.
Yes, back to those days, yeah.
So there was a big switch. For me, Teresa, that busing was a most incredible tool, and it was necessary. And then I felt, as I looked at it, it became something that became fashionable, as opposed to something that became mindful of how we interact as people. The greatest lesson for me was how to deal with racial issues as an 8-year-old.
Okay, but listen, the question I have for you now is this.
Mm-hmm.
This was a choice that you had.
Yes.
This was a choice. But
yes.
Also, this also meant that you actually traveled on a regular bus into the school, okay?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to the typical, we're gonna get a group of these people in the yellow bus and we're gonna ship them over here. That did not occur for you, am I correct?
Yes, I had a yellow bus. So we had the yellow buses. I went to my local grade school. It picked us up there. And then it went to a couple of other schools and then dropped us off at the 3 schools.
Various schools that you chose. But those were choices people had. It wasn't like it was forced, am I correct?
Absolutely. It was not forced. And why it happened, my mother was interviewed for a TV program. They've lost all of that tape. At this point, because I've called the TV station and they didn't save those shows at that time, but she had been interviewed on the Karen Valentine show. People in Iowa that are old enough would remember Karen Valentine. And why it happened or how it happened, that I couldn't tell you. I just know it did happen, and I was one of the first to be bused, and it was the game changer, along with my home life. It most definitely was.
So that was the next set of questions I'm asking. Do you think, you talk about your experience, and do you have a sense of whether it made a difference in your personal, professional life?
It did. It made a difference because I could navigate, I said the racism, but how to persevere and look at people. And you know how our senator used to say things that make you go, well, I was able to reason out how to look at people and situations and say, Now, it also taught me how to manage the internal anger that we carry as Black men, as Black women, as Black people, because the patterns of what we are told to us, or people needing to touch the hair, or coming up and rubbing you and how are you today? It's like that goes on to this day. And even at my age, I have people asking me, how do I cut my hair? So, it helped me to manage that. But I understand why most of us have high blood pressure.
There you go.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
The stresses, the life experiences is what causes some of this angst. And as a result, from a psychological point of view, and you wonder why people, pursue, and you think, oh, what's the matter with that person? But if you think about what you have to go through in the society, not understanding the kinds of pressures that are taking place, the subtle kinds of things that people experience day to day, not just every once in a while, but every single day they get up and they get out of the bed and they go out into the world, and this is what they can experience to this day.
Absolutely.
To this day.
Well,
So I'm just asking, now I'm a transfer over to this other issue. Now you're a music professor. What you said, and I'm gonna go back to this because what I talked about often in my book was about how there's a relationship between academic achievement and musical acumen. Right. So you have that as well. But what happened in the talk about those of us who were in my book, we talked about how we each all played an instrument. We did not attend these schools unless we had an instrument, either band or orchestra. So do you think that your musical acumen enhanced your ability to be able to cope more effectively in the settings that you attended?
Not only is that true, but what it also did, it leveled the playing field of how I appeared in the eyes of those who were white. That was
relate more. Give me more specifically. Can you describe it more specifically?
Okay. Let's say we couldn't enter chorus until 4th grade in grade school. We had music in our class, but then you were in chorus 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. Of course, we were in grade school, which went through 6th grade, and then it was junior high.
7, 8, and 9?
Yeah, 7, 8, 9, and then high school was 10, 11, and 12.
Okay.
And so what would happen? I'd be singing, and I would notice if people were looking at me, or I would notice how Mrs. Obreza in grade school would call me out in a good way because of how I sang. That's the one place where I knew that nobody could mess with me. And not in a big-headed way, but that was one thing I had. And I didn't start my tennis playing until after that, really. But
was it a confidence builder?
Oh, absolutely. There was, as long as, and to this day, when I'm looking at the world and I have my little moments, I can sing myself to a place of wellness, because music, even then as now, and as I explained to my students, is the great equalizer. You can't taste it, you can't touch it, but you certainly can feel it. And those vibrations, for those very moments that people feel that connection from a human standpoint, then your color doesn't matter, your class doesn't matter, how much money you have or do not have doesn't matter. And I knew from an early age, I came out of the womb a singer. I knew that that was the road to my humanity.
Okay, great point you made there. Very great point. Because I'm thinking, what if you didn't have the music? I think it would have been a completely different situation, correct?
I think, I mean, the guidance of my mother, see, the brilliance of her is that she allowed me to explore. And we talked. So, at that time, and I imagine with you, I always ask my students, just how many times during the week do you sit at a dinner table? See, we had to sit at a dinner table, and I grew up in a very small home, but guess what? There was a tablecloth, you set the plates, you had the napkin, you had the knife and the fork and the spoon. I knew how to set those things even in my little, what I call a lean-to of a house, but I had a house and I always had food and some clothes. And so the manners that we were taught I think on some level, in general, have disappeared.
Oh, they don't even exist now. They don't even exist.
I tried to be kind, but you just,
I mean,
yeah.
even and this is several years. I mean, you think about it. I mean, I think much of occurred with the fast food movement. Really kind of disintegrated that whole process. Because we sat down as a family and we had dinner. Mom, dad, my sister and I, we sat down, we had dinner as a family. Okay, so that was something that was routine. It wasn't like unusual. That was routine. Set the place tables. Set the place. Settings and everything. That was routine. And so I understand what you're saying, and I wonder if those same kind of, and it goes back to the issue of values. Okay, values become very significant. Do you believe if those values transferred over into what you're doing professionally?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. I'm in entertainment, so that how I get hired for a gig, I don't know. But not having how to meet people and greet people and meet them where they are and try to be open to learning myself. Because I'm a student, I'm a teacher, but I am a student. And there's no substitute for that. And if I may say, those values, there are 2 or 3 of those classmates from all those years ago at Windsor Heights Elementary School that every now and again give me a shout out and have followed me and I didn't know. One is Alan Andrew, Debbie Dirksen, Vicki Gillespie. The names and what people said to me, either positive or negative, I remember every one of them.
To this day, right?
I remember every last one of them. I remember when Rodney spit on me on the playground in 2nd or 3rd grade and how I was called into the office because he ran zigzag and I was pushing people. And I remember.
You recall those moments, huh?
Yeah. But
what kind of impression has that left with you? I mean, how has that made you feel today, having had those experiences and your interaction with people who you knew grew up during that same era? Does that have an impact now?
It has an impact in the sense that it keeps me good because I have anger issues. And then I have that experience all those years ago to look upon and see how not all is bad. And I'm always reminded every day to do my best to take a person for who they are and not who I assume that they are, because I'm like everybody else. I can classify a group of people very easily based upon what's happened to me. But there are those moments in life, there are those moments in junior high and high school where I have seen that there are good people across the board, and that's how it is transferred. But to deal with those issues, there's nothing wrong with going to an all-Black school or an all-white school, but I feel that I benefited more than most by having at least my Black community and then my mostly white school and dealing with things at such a young age, because children are better equipped actually to handle those things than we are.
Exactly. That's why I'm saying that's the other thing. The earlier start that gives you exposure, but it also, what you're explaining in your experience is that having the nurturing to go along with it, but to have a child not having that nourishment to go home and have a conversation, to have an environment that was supportive, that may make a difference for their movement forward. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And also, can we not forget, we had what were called bus aides.
On the bus.
And a couple of them were ladies in my church. So Mrs. Miller knew me at church. She knew me on the bus. Mrs. Beulah Holland knew me at church. She knew me on the bus. So guess what? We were good, because whatever we did there, we knew was going to make it home before we got home.
Yes.
And they were the no-nonsense Black women. You know that look that you can get from 100 yards. Yeah, and it's, I don't know how y'all do it, but nonetheless, it translates. We understand, okay, don't do anything but breathe, huh? And I saw that kind of change with the nature of the types of students, not across the board, but there were always one or two bad apples, but that's part of the learning experience as well.
Yes, yes. Nothing's perfect, correct?
Right, exactly. And I got into fights every now and again, not much, but I did.
But so do you feel that the exposure early on made a difference as opposed to started when you were in high school?
Absolutely. I think this thing about when we teach kids, of course, now, you know, nationwide with things about gender identity and all that kind of stuff, kids just don't have that angst. They just don't. They love to love. And for me, you put it in terms that they can understand. The busing program was put in terms that I could understand. My mother talked to me. Now I can look back all these years later, and just the way we talked at dinner and how things were going. She was there to make sure my homework was done. You know, and I liked school. Now that's the other difference. I liked school. So all of those things that could happen there, all of the teachers and all who were looking at me and the students, I liked school. And there were any number of teachers who were very accepting as well, and students.
Okay. Now, were you the only child?
Yes.
Okay, that's why I was gonna ask you, were you the only child? Because I didn't know that. Because sometimes, you know, you are used to being able to deal with things with yourself as an only child, as opposed to having 3 and 4 siblings all around, because it would have diffused the process a little bit. Okay.
Right.
And so I wanted to know if that made a difference to you as well. So you were able to focus and you were able to have that attention that like you have 4 or 5 siblings, it would have been a completely different situation.
Right. Right. And I think that's probably true. I sometimes as only children, we get a bad rap or a preacher's kid. And sometimes that can be true, but I was my mother's priority, but not to the extent that I always got along with myself very well, or I got along with others. But we had citizenship classes in that they were called citizenship classes, something on that, where you talked about how you get along with people. All I saw were white kids on the screens, but you know, it's, and then I went to church where the ladies wore hats and gloves, you know, and that kind of thing. And the men wore hats, you know. And the 60s, because of everything that was going on, I really remember.
Were you aware of that? Were you aware of that?
I most definitely was aware, because we had some of the Black Panthers in Iowa. We had a man by the name of Kalanji Sadig, who had his radio program. We had, I was very conscious of Martin Luther King being shot in '68. Okay. And the history of Iowa, just with Center Street, with, we had Katz Drugstore downtown, where when my mother worked at a major company, they paid them in cash. So she would try to get this $100 bill broken, and they would always have to call the store after several years to make sure that she was an employee kind of thing, or sitting at the counter. Yeah. So we have our history in that as well. Okay. But the overtness of the racism, I do not think was as bad as other places. It was there. And I say in Iowa, it was the kind of thing where it was behind closed doors. Okay. See, I'd rather be called the N-word to my face, because then I can deal with you. Yeah. But at home, we have to be detectives and know that, oh, you're smiling and saying this, but what are you really saying when you go behind the closed door? So that was the perception you had growing up. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Okay. So you think that prepared you for the future? Oh, it most definitely did. What I hope, while I feel that I am more jaded because of my experiences, what I'm trying to do personally is not let that run my life, because I've seen these patterns play out over and over. And as I teach, I see my students in general that are less aware than we were about what's going on, but also they're mixing more. If we had dated outside of our culture in high school, when I was growing up, you would kind of try to keep that quiet. You know, Of course, New York as a whole, I think New York is one of the
Oh,
most segregated cities in the country.
yes,
However, you at least get to see everybody and his brother. When
right.
I grew up at home, it was black and white, and there were quite a few Mexicans
Mhm.
um, in town. And in fact, the meat packing plants, that
But
are
yeah, all
notorious.
of it. Yeah, yeah,
So it prepared me for a lot of things, but I am daily thinking about how not to be uh, a bad person in my thoughts towards people because of this. But I have the experiences, and I have the brain power right now to kind of talk to myself, if you will.
okay, okay. So in terms, in closing, because I don't want to keep too much longer, any final thoughts on what the future may hold?
Um, well, I'm going to tell you, I think that there are a couple of ways to look at it. I think first, if people don't really learn to read and write and not have a machine do it for them, I think we're in trouble. I think being able to write is very creative, and it's about the body movement. Being able to read is about being able to expand your thought process and hopefully have comprehension.
Yes.
The other thing I see where is it? Where is my phone? I was telling a student the other day that where you and I'm trying to be a little funny, might be in assisted living someday. For those students that we are teaching now, this is their assisted living.
Yes. Yes.
And but this cannot feed you, this cannot turn you so you don't get bed sores, this cannot hold your hand. And
Mhm.
what I find is that how we communicate has changed so much. Um, I haven't lost all hope for the future. I see some brilliance in my students, and they remind me of the zest for life. But we're in a precarious situation right now. We
Okay.
really are. Mentally, from those that are taking a pill or in therapy. Um, but I have the reminders, Teresa, that it is not all is lost.
Good point. Good point. Okay. Good point. Well, thank you, Professor Turner, for sharing your experience of the busing experience and how it impacted your life then and now. And I
Yes.
appreciate the time you've taken out. And I hopefully the audience will understand that there are different experiences and how we're looking forward to the future and how this may help impact us moving forward.
Well, Dr. Canada, you are one of my points of validation. When we had you at the school and I heard you speak, I'm serious. You are a point of validation. Meeting you, being a part of this podcast lets me know that I'm living right. And I'd also like to add, there are Black people in Iowa, just so.
Yes, that's what's so fantastic. Okay, I have him on my podcast. And people say, what? In Iowa? Are you
Yeah,
kidding?
all right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you for confirming that and documenting that. So I have this documentation. So we're not going to lose this recording. We're not going to lose this. So
Oh,
thank you again, and I appreciate the time you've taken out. And hopefully we can move forward and have something else coming up. Is that
okay.
good?
Well, all right. And peace, love, and joy to you and yours. Enjoy your day.
Thank you so much. And good night, goodbye, everybody, and we'll see you the next episode. Have a good
Okay.
day.
All right.